So thank you so much for the opportunity to present. This is going to be a different talk from what we've just heard. I'm Petra Browne. We're at Deakin University with Tamara, my colleague. Tamara's in the School of Medicine. I'm in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. My background in political philosophy, and Tamara's more. This conference is more in Tamara's field. So our presentation looks at the impact of COVID-19, particularly in relation to women and the vulnerabilities they've experienced in a global pandemic. So there is strong evidence that the impact of the pandemic are deepening existing social inequalities. This includes a negative impact on women. Globally, women are more likely to be employed in the informal economy and are therefore more susceptible to falling into extreme poverty as a result of economic disruption. Women have been subjected to sexual and physical violence, and they found themselves living in isolation with abusive intimate partners. Women have taken on the burden of caring and schooling children forced to study from home, even whilst trying to maintain incomes. And many women, and young women in particular, have been unable to access reproductive health care needs, including access to contraception, abortion, and maternal health care, due to travel restrictions, lockdowns, and diversion of health funding to deal with the pandemic. And this has been particularly marked in developing countries where women's healthcare is already precarious. So these are just the kinds of stories that have emerged throughout 2020. So why do women bear the burden of a global pandemic? Looking at previous pandemics, such as the Ebola and Zika outbreaks, public health researchers concluded that women in particular have less power in decision making. For this reason, their needs go unseen, unheard, and unmet. Women, suggest such researchers, should be included at higher levels of decision making around COVID-19 global responses. So here's a quote by some public health researchers saying that given their frontline interaction with communities, it is concerning that women have not been fully incorporated into global health surveillance, security surveillance, detection and prevention mechanisms. Women's socially prescribed care roles typically place them in a prime position to identify trends at a local level that can then improve global health security. And they note, although women should not be further burdened, particularly considering much of their labor during health crises goes underpaid or unpaid, incorporating their voices and knowledge could be empowering and improve outbreak preparedness and response. Yet this may be easier said than done, because researchers with experts in geopolitics consider the way the 2020 global pandemic has challenged existing territorial, political, and government orders. They note that a crisis often highlights existing socioeconomic, gender, class, and ethnicity-related inequalities, as they impact some groups more than others. This belies Madonna's insight that COVID was the great equalizer, proclaimed for her pink rose petal filled bathtub and shared via Instagram video with her 15.9 million fans in 2020. I resisted the temptation to put a slide in there featuring Madonna. So far from equalizing populations with the phrase that we are all in it together, another popular kind of trope that politicians like to use, pandemics instead reveal the uneven capacity to act and react for some, while for others they present opportunities for profiteering. Indeed, a crisis not only highlights pre-existing inequalities, but has the potential to deepen those inequalities as emergency measures are put into place to address the crises. And the particular nature of the global pandemic has powerfully revealed a very strong link between health impacts and political implications. Interpreting and responding to pandemics is always a political act, suggest geopolitical researchers. For long-term recovery from a global pandemic, social equity and intergenerational justice are integral as these foster well-being and sustainability in space and over time. One challenge and opportunity that emerges from the global pandemic is to consider then what a future social contract with the citizen might look like. So we can take these insights into the political implication of the pandemic and connect this to the advice of public health researchers that incorporating women's voices and knowledge could be empowering and improve outbreak preparedness and response. We can see that a reconfigured social contract should include women's voices, both as a pragmatic response to enable successful emergency health interventions at local levels, but also as something that's important in building social equity and intergenerational justice that are key to the ongoing flourishing of societies. Yet, there are many significant structural challenges to incorporating women in political decision-making processes, not least of which are that the political and legal institutions in the West are built on the idea of a social contract, at the heart of which resides the autonomous and independent liberal subject, notes critical feminist and legal theorist Martha Feynman. Feminist philosophers suggest that the account of autonomy and conceptions of agency offered through philosophy are too often framed in terms of methodological individualism, which presupposes that the individual, their intentions, goals, beliefs, and desires are the starting point of philosophy, and that claims about the social world are ultimately reducible to facts about individuals. Feminists reject what they refer to as an atomistic account of the self and the value of autonomy that emerges from this account, or at least the feminists I'm looking at today. They see this account as itself embedded in social relations in which the self-sufficiency held up as a neutral model is actually the ideal of the self-sufficient man. So Marilyn Friedman describes the history of liberal autonomy as associated with male biographies and male identified traits, which is a view of autonomy that is ultimately inhospitable to women in the way it represents a masculine style preoccupation with self-sufficiency and self-realization at the expense of human connection. In her critique of traditional autonomy, Friedman considers the personal and social dimensions that influence a woman's stance towards exercising her autonomy. Given that traditional autonomy it tends to disrupt existing social relationships, which have impacted women at a disproportionate rate, Friedman notes that women can often express autonophobia, a fear of autonomy, not of their own actions, but the impact of the actions of others on them. So Friedman suggests it's important that autonomy of a relationship is not held up as some kind of cultural or social ideal. Alongside this capacity to exercise one's autonomy, we should also value the commitments and responsibilities such as the care of the vulnerable that make relationships and communities worthwhile. Catriona Mackenzie shares a critique similar to Friedman in that she also views the ideal citizen in traditional account as being too far modeled on the rational independent contractor, which does not take into account the many vulnerable relationships that already exist in society. Mackenzie notes that the rhetoric of maximal choice, amongst other things, shifts often functions to mask social injustice, structural inequality, and corrosive disadvantage. The focus on the individual shifts responsibility and attention away from the collective. She suggests it's not enough to speak of autonomy as an ideal when an important measure of a just society is the extent to which its political, social, and legal institutions support its citizens' capacities for autonomy, suggests Mackenzie. So Mackenzie wants to provide a richer account that includes capacity and social recognition. And she does through exploring three aspects of autonomy: self-determination, self-governance, and self-authorization that retain some sense of the traditional meaning, but also acknowledges the broader political context that may impact on opportunities to exercise autonomy. A just society is one in which political, social, and legal institutions actively support the development of citizens' capacities for autonomy, as understood in this broader framework. Mackenzie and Friedman both offer alternative accounts of autonomy that can be characterized as forms of relational autonomy. And while time constraints prevent an in-depth exploration of their respective alternatives, for both, the feminist account of autonomy includes value commitments, responsibilities such as care of the vulnerable, and extends beyond individual decision-making processes to also include public consciousness and discourse. One important point of debate in relational autonomy discussion is the question of what counts as exercising one's autonomy, a question that is particularly pressing in situations where gender oppression is evident. Gendered context can lead to diminished capacities to exercise autonomy, so much so that it can exhibit self-abnegation, adaptive preferences, and even willingly adopting what appear to be gender oppressive practices. For this reason, exercising autonomy should not be considered in absolute terms, but rather as a matter of degree, or more or less, according to Friedman, or scalar, according to Mackenzie. Thus, autonomy is possible when some of our goals and commitments might be self-chosen, even if others continue to be the result of social and relational influences. Relational autonomy in this context acknowledges that we often already exist in unchosen relationships that impact on our self-identity and opportunities. Practicing autonomy in a scalar way, as more or less, orients itself not only towards its self-assertion, but in relationship with and towards others that includes a recognition of vulnerability. If we consider relational autonomy as a matter of degree, of more or less, then we can further see a wide application of this theory in practical contexts. And indeed, many of you may recognize that relational autonomy is already has emerged powerfully within the context of applied disciplines, including bioethics, health studies, nursing, law, psychology, education, and aged care. Even though, as Mackenzie notes, as a theoretical concept, in philosophy proper, it's still very much relegated to special interest discussions. But seeing it in applied context provides a welcome opportunity to move beyond a theoretical lens that often arrives at impasses to an appreciation for the process of how individuals arrive at the ability to authorize consent or come to autonomous decision making, suggests the philosopher Sylvia Burrow, writing in the context of healthcare for vulnerable groups. Burrow notes that the traditional account of autonomy as self-governing individuals is particularly difficult to enact in practice, for in reality, healthcare decisions are rarely made in isolated conditions, and a shift to relational autonomy considers the extent to which a person's decision-making is facilitated or inhibited by a multitude of factors. This is particularly important in healthcare, where structures of power and privilege impact on decision-making, notes Burrow. So, the work of feminist philosophers can helpfully illuminate practical contexts in which autonomous decision making is of concern. And these practical situations also help us to recognize that a person's decision making processes take place in concrete contexts, which can empower or hinder decision making. So, as an applied practice considered at local and social levels, perhaps relational autonomy can potentially offer a model to address issues that impact on political communities in a global context, such as the responses to COVID-19. Yet, some feminists have explicitly rejected the notion of autonomy altogether, and they have done so because the political and legal institutions that have emerged from our social contract have overemphasized individual liberty to such an extent that it has resulted in the diminishing of options and autonomy for many others, as many parts of societies have become more and more unequal. So critical feminist and legal theorist Martha Feynman rejects the idea that autonomy is inherent human characteristics that should be highly valued, but rather it is cultivated by society, just as a legal system that is built around the values of the liberal subject defines and constructs the notion of the family with all of its roles and responsibilities differentiated along gendered lines. It has located dependency and vulnerability in the private sphere. Within the family unit, a zone of privacy, writes Feynman, that is beyond the scope of state concern, absent extraordinary family failures, such as abuse or neglect. Whenever there is a as a private concern, vulnerability itself has therefore been effaced from public discourse and political interest in a meaningful way. And for Feynman, this concept of vulnerability must be detached from its association with specific groups such as caretakers, and it must be recognized as the very meaning of what it means to be human that is also at the heart of our ideas of social and state responsibility. Somewhat radically, Feynman suggests that the state should start not from the premise of autonomous independent individuals, but from a position of vulnerability as the organizing principle that then in turn informs laws and policies that lessen vulnerability. Feynman's insights show that cultural change is difficult. As an example to illustrate this point, consider the gendered nature of care work and chores that are the backbone of the unpaid economy of the liberal economic model. Pre-pandemic, this work was largely undertaken by women. Even before the pandemic, it was estimated that women were doing about 3/4 of the 16 billion hours of unpaid work that are done each day around the world. Following COVID, the burden of unpaid work on women has also increased. And with this, employment and educational opportunities are reduced. So much so that United Nations Women Deputy Executive Director Anita Bhatia has declared that everything we worked that has taken 25 years could be lost in a year. The problem is that the very institutions that require change in order to facilitate richer notions of autonomy are themselves constituted in such a way that they constantly serve to preserve the status quo of the self-interested, independent, rational contractors, relegating questions of care and vulnerability to the unpaid and unrecognized private sphere. And I think it's worth noting that applied ethics in healthcare contexts also retains in some sense this origin story in which bodily vulnerability is treated as an issue of the individual or private person rather than part of public discourse that considers the values of a flourishing society. Feynman's insights suggest that scalar expressions of autonomy may not be enough to address these kind of entrenched masculinist values. In conclusion, the global pandemic has highlighted existing inequalities. Political responses have varied, from those that entrench inequalities to interventions that actively seek to address vulnerabilities. In this context, addressing vulnerabilities requires the voices of the vulnerable, for example, women's voices, but such an act itself may require interrogation of long-held assumptions, particularly the nature of the social contract of the citizen with the state. Relational autonomy is one way these long-held assumptions are being interrogated in philosophical contexts, but often this has remained at a theoretical level. Current applied context could provide insight for other applications, including political decision-making in a global pandemic where healthcare is deeply politicized. Nevertheless, this remains difficult. To assume that women in positions of leadership will somehow address the lived vulnerabilities experienced in a global pandemic ignores the toxic and entrenched masculinism at the heart of the Western political subject. This masculinism has, in fact, seemed to grow in influence during the pandemic, even as vulnerable communities of women bore the impact of the pandemic. To return to the geopolitical researchers I mentioned earlier, the global pandemic has enabled authoritarian opportunism and geopolitical skullduggery by some states, even while there has also been evidence of support and solidarity towards vulnerable communities, including migrants, asylum seekers, and victims of domestic violence. To incorporate women's voices and knowledge into a climate of geopolitical skullduggery will be a challenging feat indeed.